name's Francis Briers, sometimes known as the Rev, and I'm here to offer a spiritual response to life's questions. So, something I've been reflecting on recently is a sense of self, who I really am. And I'd imagine this is a question that many of us, many of you, may have thought about at some point in your life. And in psychology there's often the typical considerations of nature and nurture. That is there something essential or maybe based in the DNA that we are born with, and then how our environment shapes us. And I don't know for sure about those things. I've not come across anyone who has any definite answers. And then from a spiritual point of view, many traditions have some sense of a core part of us that is unchanging or that we're born with. Sometimes it's called a soul, sometimes a spirit, or all sorts of names from around the world. So there's this part of us that sometimes is described as a seed of God, a part of us that is constant and unchanging. And funnily enough, I'm not going to talk about that either, because in a way that idea seems to be so attached to certain worldviews or spiritual perspectives, and it's so hard to pin down that in some ways I'm not sure whether it's useful to really talk about it a lot. In the Hawaiian tradition, when they talk about different gods, those gods, in some ways of interpreting it, and these aren't just modern Western ways of interpreting it, but some of the traditional ways of interpreting it, those gods represent aspects of our being, aspects of our psyche and our energetic or spiritual being. And when I ask questions of someone, an expert in this field, around, is there one essential creator or kind of origin of all things, they said yes. It's called the Kumalipo, which is also the name of the creation chant. There's a chant that is like the creation myth, a bit like Genesis in the Bible. It's the myth of how things were created, how the world was created. And I said, oh wow, I've not heard a lot talked about the Kumalipo. Can you talk about that God, that aspect of God, or the origin of all things? And they said, no, not really. The Hawaiians kind of go, well, this is as I understand it, that in the Hawaiian tradition it's considered that, well, that's there before the beginning of time, it'll be there after the end of time, it's there all the way through, it's constant and unchanging and limitless and infinite, and kind of no point talking about it because it doesn't make any difference. It's just there, it's like the wallpaper, why talk about it? Which I find interesting, and in a way I think a concept of self as soul, this unchanging part of us, or this seed of God, while in some ways in the spiritual traditions that's the most essential thing, that connecting with that, being connected with that, being aligned with that could be considered the most essential part of the journey. In a pragmatic day-to-day way, I kind of consider the nature of that thing, that part of us, that aspect, that being, that seed of God, seed of beingness, seed of the Tao, seed of the great monkey in the sky, whatever you want to call it, as not really being all that helpful to talk about. So what's been on my mind around identity, around who I am recently, is that there seem to be certain aspects of myself that are pretty constant, and they just seem to be who I am, constitutionally, like it's in my skin and blood and bones. And whether I like it or not, that's kind of who I am. That's part of how I turn up. And it feels really valuable to get aware, a real heightened awareness of what those qualities are, and then to love them. even when they're not necessarily the ones I would most like. You know, I'd love to be grand and charismatic. I'd love to be inspiring. And maybe in some ways I am. But for instance, one of the qualities that stands out very clearly for me as part of who I am is that I'm dependable, that there's a kind of trustworthiness about me that people seem to experience. I get feedback about that. And I see it in myself. And you know, I've struggled with that for years. There's a way that that's a person I want to be. I want to be trustworthy. I want people to experience me as a guy you can count on in some way. But it also sounds kind of boring, and particularly, you know, when you're 16 and trying to attract girls, being dependable is not sexy. So I've struggled with it. But more and more, and I'm sure some of this is my age too, more and more I'm coming to love that part of myself, that aspect of who I am, that quality of my being. And more I'm coming to understand its value. And I think I'm learning to wield it more wisely and skillfully in terms of how I turn up in my life and in my work. So, while there are many philosophies around the nature of identity and the nature of finding your strengths and making the most of those, I'd really encourage you to seek to understand what those fundamental constitutional parts of yourself are and love them, even if they're not the ones you would have chosen. And maybe in loving ourselves in this day-to-day and pragmatic way, in the qualities of being that we just turn up as, whether we like it or not, maybe that kind of self-love is part of what helps us be more aligned, more in the flow with that seed of God, our soul, perhaps. Those are my thoughts anyway, and they're offered as ever with love.